Welcome to the deep dive. So, if you've ever paid close attention to how the news covers, acts of violence, you've probably noticed a pattern. It's a confusing one.
It's a really disturbing pattern, actually.
Right. When one person commits a crime, the focus is all on them, on their personal issues. But when someone else commits the exact same crime, suddenly the conversation just explodes.
It balloons out, yeah. It becomes a demand for answers, for apologies from an entire community.
And that's the question we're looking at today. Why? Why does society have this bias demanding collective blame for Black Americans, but completely isolating the actions of white perpetrators?
The puzzle that shows up everywhere. I mean, cable news, local reporting, even in courtrooms. And our sources really dig into this fundamental question.
So why is one person's terrible act treated like a glitch in the system, but another's is proof that an entire community is broken? That's our mission for this deep dive.
Exactly. We're looking at sources that really detail how racial hierarchies and history and media framing, all of it, determines who gets to be an individual.
And who gets stuck with the burden of representing their entire race.
And here's the core claim, the thing you have to keep in mind through all of this difference in language. It is not a coincidence. It's not just a mistake.
It's intentional.
It's a direct reflection of these long-standing racial ideologies in America. One's designed to maintain who's seen as the default human and who's always seen as a collective problem.
Okay, let's unpack this. I think the best place to start is with the words themselves, the actual language that's used. So when a white person commits an act of serious violence, the vocabulary that pops up, it's all about protection. It's about isolating that person from the group. What are some of those terms we always hear?
Oh, they're instant in terms of psychological distancing. The first one is always lone wolf. He was a lone wolf.
Right.
And then the narrative immediately pivots to these mitigating factors. It's all about personal failure. He had a troubled past, or he struggled with mental health issues.
Or the classic, he just snapped.
He just snapped.
Exactly. And that's a shortcut to avoid any deeper analysis of a culture or group.
And then the community response, the one we hear after almost every tragedy like this is not who we are.
Yes.
That phrase right there, that's such a crucial tool.
Yeah.
It walls off the perpetrator as this tragic anomaly and exception. And by doing that, it protects the group from having to take on any kind of collective responsibility.
It's a really effective way to absolve the collective. But now you flip the script. And this is where the sources just show this bias so starkly. When the perpetrator is Black, the language changes completely.
The focus shifts.
Yeah.
It moves from the individual's mind to the supposed failure of the entire community.
Totally. You immediately hear things like Black on Black crime. And it's a term that's almost never racialized for any other group, right?
Yes.
You never hear about white on white crime.
Never. And the questions change too. It's not what was wrong with him. It becomes what is wrong with them. Exactly. The narrative just expands. It asks, where are the Black leaders?
Right.
Or, this act reflects deeper cultural issues. A single action from one person is suddenly tied to everything. Fatherlessness, community breakdown, a so-called culture of violence.
And the contrast is it's staggering. A white man commits a mass shooting, and the headline might be, troubled employee snaps, citing persecution.
Right.
But a Black man does the same thing, and suddenly it's spike in inner city violence raises questions about community leadership.
What's fascinating here is the consequence of that split. White violence is always interpreted as an exception, a personal, tragic failure. But Black violence, that's presented as the rule.
It's confirmation of a stereotype.
It's confirmation of a pathology that, justifies more scrutiny, more policing.
So what we're seeing is a deliberate choice. Either you grant the individual insulation from their group, or you force them to represent the moral failures of their group. And race seems to be the deciding factor. But why? Why is this framework so easily accepted?
Well, that's the thing. This isn't some new media invention. It's really the ghost of American history that's still dictating how we react.
And that's the pivot, isn't it? To really get why we're almost hardwired to see it this way, you have to go back. You have to look at the history of racial ideology in the U.S.
For centuries, the entire system was designed around this idea. Whiteness was the standard for being an individual, for being human. And Blackness was constructed as something different, as a collective, a group to be managed.
And you can see this so clearly in the historical examples of collective punishment. I mean, let's start with slavery.
Right. Our sources show that the goal was always control, never justice. So if one enslaved person resisted or tried to escape, the punishment was almost never just for them.
The whole plantation might suffer.
The entire group could face brutal repercussions. More whippings, smaller rations, privileges taken away. The system was designed to make the group police itself.
It taught everyone that their collective fate depended on every single person complying.
Yeah.
It erases individual agency completely.
And that idea didn't just vanish with emancipation, it changed form. It morphed into new kinds of racial terror.
Like during the Jim Crow era.
Exactly. If a single black man was accused of something, and often it was a completely fabricated accusation, the retaliation wasn't just aimed at him, it was aimed at the entire black community.
This is where the horror of lynching comes in, where entire black neighborhoods, whole towns were targeted. The goal wasn't just punishment, it was about sending a message.
A violent message that the black community was a collective problem and that they would be held collectively responsible.
So after centuries of this, it's baked into the national consciousness.
It is. White communities were treated as the default, the norm, people, with a right to be seen as individuals. But black communities were continuously defined as suspicious, problematic, a group that needed to be managed.
And that creates this crushing burden of explanation today.
It's unbearable. If you're white, your violence is a personal tragedy. But if you're black, your violence immediately becomes a critique of everything. Your parents, your culture, your leaders, every single other black person's character.
The demand is placed on the collective. Black leaders, politicians, pastors, athletes, they're expected to apologize, to condemn, to offer solutions, sometimes before the facts are even out.
And that demand, that itself is the proof. It's that centuries-old idea of collective identity being used as a tool of control right now, today.
So history set the stage, but how does modern media keep this dynamic going? Especially when it comes to who gets sympathy and who doesn't.
The historical foundation is intimate. It's actively reinforced every single day, mainly by how the news media frames these events. I mean, decades of research have confirmed this. There's a consistent racial bias in reporting.
And it comes down to who gets a complex story and who doesn't.
Exactly. Who gets empathy? For white offenders, the media tends to humanize them. We get a deep dive into their life. We hear about their mental illness, losing a job, social isolation. The narrative explores why the individual failed.
The goal is to find complexity, to understand the person. They get a full biography. Think about those detailed stories about a shooter's childhood or manifesto. We try to understand the man.
But for black offenders, that complexity just vanishes. The frame shifts immediately to generalized societal problems.
We don't get a biography, we get statistics.
Right. Their actions are tied to community violence or the cycle of poverty. The question becomes why the community failed to stop it.
This really gets at that idea of a default status.
Right.
Whiteness is framed as normal, neutral, individual. Blackness is framed as different, threatening, collective.
And you can only be an individual if your identity is already aligned with that neutral baseline.
So the implication for the audience, whether they realize it or not, is huge. For a white person who commits violence, the question is, what went wrong with him?
What made him deviate from the norm?
But for a black person, the question becomes, what is wrong with them? And that changes the entire conversation that follows.
And that's where the psychological studies on implicit bias become so important. Because those biases help explain why media outlets even go down one path versus the other, often without even thinking about it.
So what do those studies show? How does that bias create a sympathy gap?
The research is pretty clear. People tend to assume innocence and complexity in white suspects. They get the benefit of the doubt. So the mental health narrative feels plausible. It feels sympathetic.
He must have been really troubled.
That's the immediate reaction. But those same studies find that people assume guilt and danger in black suspects. They're seen as older, more threatening, more responsible for their actions, even when they're children.
There's no complexity assumed. The default is just suspicion.
So when violence happens, white suspects get stories about their loneliness, their family, the human stuff. But black suspects get mugshots and statistics about social decay. The story pathologizes the community because the individual is never really seen as just an individual.
It's a mechanism that forces one group to stand trial in the court of public opinion for every single member, while the other group gets a pass. Let's go back to that term, lone wolf. It's almost always reserved for white male violence, right? Especially terrorism or mass shootings.
Almost exclusively.
And the sources bring up a really critical fact check here. Statistically, white men commit the majority of mass shootings, school shootings, and domestic terror attacks in the United States.
That is the reality.
Yeah.
But despite that overwhelming data, You will never hear the media or politicians use terms like white-on-white crime or white community violence.
Or white cultural pathology. Why doesn't that vocabulary exist? Why aren't we asking what's wrong with the white community that it produces this kind of violence so often?
Well, the analysis in our sources is that the lone wolf narrative exists specifically to protect whiteness. Whiteness is treated as the unspoken norm. It's not seen as a race or a category that can be criticized without this huge explosive backlash.
So if a violent white man's actions were seen as a reflection on white culture, the whole foundation of the societal default would be threatened.
Exactly. So the double standard serves a political purpose. It protects the integrity of the dominant group while pathologizing the minority one. And that enables a form of racial control.
How so?
The constant expectation that Black Americans have to explain, apologize, and provide solutions for one person's actions. It's a form of collective surveillance. It's moral policing.
It's a demand to constantly justify your existence.
Yes, it forces an entire group to carry this burden of representation that white communities just never, ever have to face. And that imbalance has massive real-world consequences.
Right. It's not just headlines.
Not at all. When you constantly reinforce the narrative that Black communities are inherently violent, you justify over-policing them. You influence juries who bring their own biases into the courtroom. It shapes public policy.
Correct.
It just perpetuates inequality.
It's a system that ultimately signals that Black people are still outsiders, still on trial for the actions of any single person. Hashtag conclusion and synthesis. So this deep dive really makes it clear that the language of blame, it's a powerful political tool. It's not an accident. It's a system.
It is. And the system persists, first, because the country still operates on this deep-seated assumption that Black individuals are representatives.
While white individuals are just individuals.
Right. And second, the vocabulary is used very purposefully. It protects whiteness as the norm, and it pathologizes Blackness as the collective deviation from that norm.
Then there's the history. These systems of collective punishment, from slavery onward, they still shape our expectations today about who has to answer for whom.
And finally, modern media and our own implicit biases just keep reinforcing these stereotypes. It determines who gets our sympathy and who just becomes another statistic.
So what's the way out?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this double standard will only really start to fade when the country does two things. We have to de-racialize crime, talk about it as a societal failure or an individual one, not a racial one.
And at the same time,
we have to stop racializing Black identity itself. We have to allow Black people to be seen as individuals with all the same complexity and motivations as anyone else.
That shift from what's wrong with them to what went wrong with him seems like the whole battle.
It truly is.
As we wrap up, I think it's useful to take this framework beyond just crime. Think about the power of this choice individual versus collective in other parts of life. We mentioned how lone wolf cuts off discussion about the political ecosystem that might fuel an act of extremism.
And you can flip it too. Think about achievement. When someone from a marginalized group achieves something amazing, is their success credited to their personal brilliance? Or is it seen as a reflection of their whole community finally making it? Which then sets this impossible standard for everyone else.
Right. And on the flip side, how does the failure of one business owner or one academic from that same community get amplified? It's seen as a failure of the entire group. This dynamic runs so much deeper than just news headlines. It shapes how we judge both success and failure.
Something to keep turning over.
We encourage you to keep asking those questions. We'll see you on the next deep dive.